Hello and welcome to this week's episode of the Northwood Podcast. I'm your host, Heath Jones. I pastor a church in Indianapolis, Indiana called Northwood Christian Church, hence the name of our podcast, the Northwood Podcast. If you'd like to learn more about us and our values, I'd encourage you to check out our website, which you may find by typing in www.indyncc.org. That's indncc.org. And there you'll be able to find links to our values, some statements about our beliefs, as well as links to the various businesses and groups that we house throughout the course of the week, should you be interested in those. Or perhaps if you need information about our food pantry, whatever your need is, whatever you'd like to find out about us, you could find it at our website, which is indncc.org. And we hope that you check it out. Now, this episode is a bit different than the usual in that it marks the beginning of Northwood's stewardship campaign. Stewardship's this crusty old churchy word that it really just means a season through which we think hard about our resources, our finances, and how we are to use them faithfully. So it's a part of the year where I am tasked to talk a lot about money, church finances, and how all of that relates to the mission of our church. Hopefully, relates to the mission of our church. And if you aren't a member or regular attendee of Northwood, you might wonder if these next episodes, as I talk about these things, will have anything to do with you. And I think that they will relate to you, whoever you are, because we'll be discussing some of the basic principles of Christianity as it relates to finance, and that should be applicable to just about anyone who swims in those waters. And so with that disclaimer or qualifier, I can't really tell which, let's proceed. And just before we move on, we need to pause for some ads for our podcast audience. And I should mention, before I do that, that this podcast is produced by the All Indiana Podcast Network, along with dozens of other podcasts produced in Indiana for Hoosiers. And these podcasts are also meant for everyone else, even outside of state lines. So whoever you are, I encourage you to check them out. You may find them by going to wishtv.com/podcasts. That's wishtv.com/podcasts. Now, here in a moment, we'll be considering a passage from the Bible found in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 6, specifically verses 1 through 4. But first, as I said just moments ago, we need to pause for some ads for our podcast audience. And so if you're watching this on YouTube, you'll just have this awkward pause that we'll share together. But if you're listening, we'll catch you after this break. And we're back. And as I was saying, we'll be going over a passage found in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 6, verses 1 through 4, smack in the middle of Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, and I'll just read it. It goes. Beware of practicing your righteousness before others in order to be seen by them, for then you have no reward from your Father in heaven. So whenever you give alms, do not sound a trumpet before you as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and in the streets, so that they may be praised by others. Truly I tell you, they have received their reward. But when you give alms, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, so that your alms may be done in secret, and your Father who sees in secret will reward you. As I was saying before the ad break, this Sunday marks the beginning of our stewardship season. And I know, pastors are trying to find a better word than that crusty old word stewardship. It's a blast from the past decades ago, been used for decades, stewardship, this word. But I think I'm going to stick with it this year, maybe in future years, because I like what it implies, quite frankly. We may have overused it, but if you stop to pause to think about it, what it implies is that we already have what we need to be about God's work in the world. Stewardship implies you have it already. We just need to learn how to leverage it, to use what we have, to direct our resources to the places that they need to go. So this word stewardship, I like it because it does imply that we have already what we need right here in-house. In other words, there is enough raw material, human ingenuity, money, and creativity in our Northwood community and in the adjacent communities to make a difference in this world, a positive change. Now, here you may say, go on. Maybe you're thinking, yeah, this pastor is just puffing us up. Oh, of course, a pastor would say something motivational like this. It's kind of my job. Except you should know that optimism is not really in my nature. You may not know it, but I'm generally speaking a catastrophizer and a pessimist. I'll make a mountain out of a molehill. I'm typically a glass is half empty kind of guy. Brace for the worst. So it's not in my nature to take this breezy, optimistic outlook and say something like, church, keep your chins up. You have all you need to be about God's work in the world. But here I am saying it. And why? Because I am, at the end of the day, a minister of the gospel of Jesus Christ. And in the Gospels and in the Hebrew Scriptures, I encounter one story after another where a person or a community with meager resources is called to do something that feels outside the realms of possibility. And as I've read these narratives in the Bible from which we draw our faith, it's why we're here and it's why we've turned up in the first place, these stories. And as I read them, I am struck again and again by how impossible their situations felt, at least initially. There's Hagar, stuck in the desert with her dying child. No water, no hope, but help found them. Or the story of the Israelites stuck in Egypt as slaves, forced to work, suffer, and die. But help found them in the form of one man with a stutter. Moses, may have heard of him. Oh, and his brother Aaron as well. But then later when they found themselves with their backs against the sea and an army in front of them, God made a way. Later, they found themselves in the desert with no water, but water came from a dry rock. You can read these stories and others like them in the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, specifically Exodus. Also, you may read in the scriptures of David and Goliath. You've heard that story. Giants that are too big to fell. Centuries later, we read of what we'll be celebrating around Christmas time. Mary, Joseph, and the baby Jesus against the world. And these stories from our scriptures, these are writings that we claim to live by. They are meant to convince us that even when our situation seems as hopeless as a people wandering aimlessly in a dry and arid desert, God will make a way for us. God does. In fact, if you think about it, God has made a way for us in the past. So why not in the future? Not to overuse a story from the scriptures, but I will often call our attention to the story of Jesus feeding the multitude or feeding the 5,000s, however you want to put it, recorded in more than one gospel. And if you'll recall, Jesus tasks his disciples with feeding a large crowd. And they had nothing to give except we read 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish, which they were able to scrounge up. But they took what little they had and then discovered through the process that they had enough to go around. And then some at the end of the day. And the story about Jesus' disciples feeding thousands serves as a challenge to us today. In moments like these, we are to be reminded that, sometimes it's our tendency to look at the problems in the church, that these problems we're meant to engage with this mindset of scarcity, like the disciples looking at 5 loaves and 2 fish saying, there's no way. Meaning that we believe from the onset sometimes in church that we do not have enough to be about God's work in the world. It's not that we aren't aware of the problems in the world that we're meant to address, of poverty, greed, and the violence that often accompanies these things. We are even aware of our calling as followers of Jesus to engage these problems, but the problems often seem too big for us to take on, too many people to feed. The forces of greed too powerful to confront the giants that confront us. We've no Davids to fight them. They seem just too large to face. So dare we face them? But we are called to face them. We cannot get away from this call, church. And it is my conviction that God has not called us to this work to fail. So what gives? I've named this season of stewardship that we're entering into in these coming weeks, I've named it More Than Maintenance. That's the title. And the reason I named it that is because I think that maintenance has been our meager attempt recently, in recent history, for the church to live into, well, something. We may not feel capable or ready to engage the big problems the church is allegedly supposed to engage, but we can maintain. Keep the lights on. We can pay the bills and stay up with the electric bills and the water, and we can fix what needs fixed around here. And we can pay the pastor, yours truly, and the office staff that aid and help in the work. Whatever we need to do to keep things afloat, at least for now, churches can do. We can, in fact, maintain. And that's what we often do. And the question becomes, for how long? Or to put ourselves in the position of the Israelites from one of the stories we were just considering, it's as if we turned to Moses with our backs against the sea to an opposing army in front of us and say, I think that we might as well just camp out right here. Maybe we can wait them out. So maybe the opposing army, aka our troubles, will dissipate in time. So churches keep our heads down and we maintain. We keep it together, but we never move anywhere. We patch the tents. The kids grow up and then they leave the camp and we're sad. And in time, the people who are left, well, we waste away. But God has not called us to waste away, to twiddle our thumbs and to wait for this all to end. God has called us to get moving, to do more than maintain what we have. So no, God has called us to steward what we have, to take the gifts and resources that we have in-house, that you and I have together, that we have as a collective, to address the world's issues, to address these issues of poverty and suffering that surround us. So how if my church, Northwood, lived fully into this vision? We are partially, but how if we lived into it still more? During this season of stewardship, I hope to invite you into this vision for our future. Because I was recently struck by a lamentable fact. I was told that at Northwood, at my church, about 80% of our money goes toward building, upkeep, and salaries, which leaves 20% for everything else, for mission, for the work that we are actually called to do, that we actually turned up for in the first place. Now, I don't want to paint the wrong picture here. The reasons that so much goes toward maintenance, as I'm describing, in our church, well, it's very understandable, and ours is not the only church with the problems we face. And let's face it, our building is larger than we need and is very old and expensive to maintain. And do not be disillusioned. I am paid a living wage by my church, but I am by no means growing rich by my labors. Still, I am embarrassed that so much of our money at Northwood goes to maintaining our overhead, paying the bills, keeping the lights on. 80% or about, as I said, when what we want to do is be about God's mission in the world. I mean, that's what we want, don't we? I know I do. So my challenge to our community, which is admittedly aspirational, is for us to see those numbers reversed in the coming years. How if we could broadcast loudly and truthfully? How if a year from now I'm giving the same sort of talk and I can say truthfully that the majority of our money raised goes to not maintenance, but to causes and projects that make the world around us a better place, that make a difference. And I don't know if we could possibly flip it so that 80% of what we raise goes to mission and then 20% to the building or paying our employees, yours truly. But we need to try to at least move the goalposts a little closer in that direction. So say how if in the coming years I could proudly say before you that 30% goes to missions, and then next year 40%, and then half of what we raise, our calling as disciples compels us to at least try. So, over the course of the next 4 Sundays, we're going to be reflecting on these themes, on generosity, on charity, and on money, generally speaking, and the relationship that it has to us and our hearts, the hold that it may have on us. But before we leave today, I'd like to leave you with a gift. This has all been pretty heavy, and I'd like to leave you with a gift, and it has to do with that first passage that I read at the beginning. You may have noticed we haven't really touched on that passage from Matthew chapter 6 that we started out in reading. And you may have thought that on this first Stewardship Sunday, I'd be just twisting your arms for cash, maybe guilt you to give, and then pass the offering plate around. But, that's not the sort of thing I'm about. But before we conclude here today, I would like to leave you with some of the wisdom that Jesus said regarding these things. Because this enterprise of moving to a place of more than maintenance does not need to be arduous or joyless. And you'll see why in a moment. I'd like to recall your attention to the scripture passage that we did read at the beginning. And I'll just read them again, but starting at verse 2. We don't need to read all of it. And it reads, picking up towards the beginning of verse 2, "Whenever you give alms, do not sound a trumpet before you as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and in the streets, so that they may be praised by others. Truly I tell you, they have received their reward. But when you give alms, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, so that your alms may be done in secret, and your Father who sees in secret will reward you." So, if you were looking for a reason to give beyond, moving it past maintenance into missional mode, if you're looking for a reason to give aside from changing the world, bringing the realm of God near and all of that, as if that weren't enough. As I said, if you were looking for another reason to give, you should consider that you should give to your church or other important causes because, simply put, it's good for you. It's good for your soul. And it's good for your literal physical health. Don't believe me? Allow me to reference an article published in the Scientific American. The article is called "Generosity is Its Own Reward." It was written by a woman named Marina Krakowski. And in this article, Krakowski summarizes the findings of an exhaustive study which surveyed 200,000 adults in 136 countries. So this is a study that is global in scale and across class lines and race lines and all other distinctions. And they did this survey to find if there was a link between charitable giving and the subjective well-being of we humans. And the study's lead author, Laura Aknin, and her team demonstrated nearly across the board that those who gave to charitable causes reported that they experienced a greater sense of well-being and overall happiness. I'll just read from Krakowski's article. Quote, "After household income and other demographic factors were taken into account, a positive link between donations and happiness emerged in 120 of those countries, rich and poor alike. And the boost in well-being from having given in the past month was as high as it would be if the respondents' household income were to double according to the survey responses." Let that sink in. Those that gave in the last month experienced as much satisfaction as those whose income had doubled. Reading on. The researchers then ran several experiments to test if giving actually caused the happiness boost. For example, participants in Canada and South Africa, the latter a nation with much lower per capita GDP, were randomly assigned to buy a goodie bag either for themselves or for a sick child in a local hospital. In both countries, those who had spent the money on the anonymous child reported feeling happier than those who had spent the money on themselves. End quote. Amazing. Especially that point that I highlighted a second ago, that those who gave generously experienced as much satisfaction as those whose income had doubled. The study's authors surmised that generosity and charitable giving was absolutely necessary in the end for humans to thrive in antiquity and in these days. Altruism and sharing, it turns out, still are key components to a community's survival and thriving and to your own mental health. It's almost as if we were called to this kind of life. It's almost as if we were made for this sort of thing. It's almost as if this is how humans are supposed to be, because this way leads to a better life for us all, the way of generosity. One of the claims of Christianity is that we are. We are called to this kind of life, which is why the early church took the form that it did. If you've read about it in the beginning of the book of Acts, in the early days of the church, it was reported that its members were so generous that no one in that community had any need. Just imagine you live in a community where no one has a need, all needs met. And our faith calls us to this kind of life, a life which is, as I hope you'll come to see, good for us emotionally, mentally, physically, and spiritually. In short, turns out, just like the article says, giving is its own reward. But motives can be tricky. I was once given a gift with the price tag left on it, and I was rather embarrassed for the gift giver, so I didn't call their attention to it until they called my attention to it. Turns out they left it on purpose so that I would know and appreciate how expensive the gift was. And in that moment, the gift felt cheaper rather than costlier. And in the few verses I read from Matthew chapter 6, Jesus advises us away from this way. He advises us all to give secretly, so secretly that our left hand won't even know what the right is doing. Now, this is hyperbole, meant to make a point that we are to be so secret as to nearly deceive ourselves in the giving. And this is contrasted with those who broadcast loudly their giving, which is to make the gift in the end about them. So no, instead, we are to give in secret, because then our motives will be, if not certain, at least less ambiguous. And you know, God gives in this way all of the time, while the human race is largely unaware. God gives like this, anonymously. I wonder if I was grateful for the good things that I enjoy today. You know, probably not, because I all too often forget where these good things come from. The anonymous giver from above. All these gifts from God, given nearly anonymously, as I keep saying, for us all to enjoy. And sometimes I forget just who the source of these good things is. And for these good things, God does not demand credit or approval. God gives because God is love. God is made happy by this. Giving us good things gives God joy. That's it. Simple as that. And God wants us to give so that we may experience this joy for ourselves. And Jesus invites us into this life that God has called us to. Jesus invites us into this joy, into a life of generous giving, not just because of how our gifts may benefit those around us, but because this giving is good, in fact, for us. It is literally good for your health, good for your community, good for the human race. So it turns out giving generously is good for you, me, and everyone impacted by the giving. So we give secretly so that it's not about us. And we invite you on this journey with us. In the coming weeks, we'll continue to reflect on these themes. We'll challenge you to a perspective that calls us to do more than simply maintain what we have here at Northwood or in your community, wherever you're coming from. We must do more than simply maintaining what surrounds us, or that too will eventually fade. More on that next week. But for now, suffice it to say, we must move past maintenance mode at church and onto missional mode. What I mean is, we need to overcome the anxiety that causes us to cling to what we've got so that we can use what we've got to instead bless others. But in the meantime, I hope that we will each find ourselves challenged to hold our possessions and our money in an open hand and with open hearts, realizing that this way is a better way for us all. You will find more joy and fulfillment in life if you are generous. This is verified by scientific study and attested to by Jesus himself. So appeals from faith and science both. And I hope that you will discover along the way that generosity is its own reward. Do not seek out the approval of others. Give because it is good for you, for its own sake, and for the life of the world around you. As Jesus said, do not let your left hand know what your right is doing. Give what you have to those who need it and experience the joy that you were made for. Now, this was a different sort of episode, as it marks the beginning of our stewardship campaign. And as I mentioned near the beginning, as you may have gathered, this year's theme is more than maintenance. It is my hope that during this season, we here at Northwood Christian Church will be inspired to consider how we might support our church financially in such a way that we do more than maintain, putting our money literally where my mouth is right now. So we hope to raise funds, not just to maintain the status quo, keep the lights on, et cetera, but rather to spend it on life-giving work in the world. And after all, this is what we believe we are called to do here in the first place. This being said, if you are a member of our church, you will be receiving a card in the mail asking you to provide your best estimate as to how much you can give in 2024. This is helpful for us at Northwood as it will help us to discover what the shape of our budget will be for the coming year. It kind of gives us an idea of what we're working with. So if this sounds like something you'd be interested in, or if you'd like to learn more about Northwood Christian Church and our ministries and how these funds will be used, please reach out to us at admin@ndncc.org. That's ADMIN at ndncc.org. But enough of that. Until next time, we hope until then you are healthy, happy, and well, and living generously. This has been the Northwood Podcast. I'm Heath Jones. Grace and peace until next time.